finally we talk about the peripheral nervous system and its development. And by way of refresher, we're just going to sort of review very quickly the divisions of the peripheral nervous system. There's the somatic nervous system that controls voluntary actions with skin and skeletal muscles, primarily being the recipients of those impulses. And then also the autonomic or visceral nervous system. Those are your involuntary actions, the things that you cannot control and probably don't want to control, like the function of your gut and your heart. The autonomic nervous system has a sympathetic and parasympathetic division. Again, sympathetic is fight or flight, and they tend to be associated with the trunk region, the sympathetic neurons, whereas the parasympathetic division deals with sort of your maintenance activities, homeostasis, keeping things up and running. And it's associated generally with the brain and the caudal end of the spinal cord. Now, these are two neuron pathways. What does that mean? So that means that you have a preganglionic or presynaptic fiber. That's the central neuron that runs into the spinal cord ganglia. It runs from the spinal cord to the ganglia. Okay, so the central ones. And then the postganglionic fibers are after the ganglion that run from the ganglion to the innervated tissues. Now, keeping that in mind, there's sort of another division of the somatic and the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems. In the sympathetic ganglia, they tend to form very close to the spine. So consequently, the preganglionic fibers, the ones that run from the spinal cord to the ganglia, tend to be very short because the ganglia are near the spine, but the postganglionic fibers are quite long, the ones that run out to the tissues, which is the opposite of the parasympathetic ganglia, which form close to the organs that they serve. And so in that case, the preganglionic fibers are really quite long, getting from the spine to the ganglia, and the postganglionic fibers are shorter because, again, the ganglia are near the tissues that they're serving. So, spinal nerves, the ventral root. So this is, again, these are projections that come out of the spinal cord. These have to do with the ventral motor axons. So they grow out of the spinal cord towards the sclerotomes, and they're going to enter the cranial portion of the sclerotome. For those who are sort of struggling to recollect what that was, remember the somites, which we talked about deriving in the early embryo. The somites differentiate into sclerotomes, which then resegment the cranial end and the caudal end. So they've got sort of an end that's closest to the head and an end that's closest to the spine. And then the cranial end of one somite merges with the caudal end of the neighboring one, and that's the resegmentation of the somites. So at any rate, the ventral motor axons are associated with the sclerotomes. They grow out of the spinal cord into the sclerotome. And they bundle into nerves and then into what's called the ventral root, which is a much thicker bundle of nerves sort of running out of each section of the spine. Again, the motor neurons come out first, followed by the sensory neurons, and it tends to happen in a cranial to caudal fashion. Now from there, again, the sensory neurons come. They're bipolar neurons. So in this case, the body of the sensory cell is within the dorsal root ganglion. So in this case, they grow towards the spinal cord and towards the ventral root. So the cell body starts out in the dorsal root ganglion. One axon projects out into the spinal cord, another goes out into the ventral root with the motor neurons. Once the neurons get into the spinal cord, they then synapse with the association neurons. So we talked about those before. Here they are now. Those are the neuron in black in the picture. And it allows the motor neuron and the sensory neuron to speak to each other. The spinal nerves are then the bundles of motor and sensory neurons. Okay, so the dorsal root ganglia combined with that ventral root coming together to form the spinal nerve that extends out from the spinal cord. Okay, from there we have further organization into what are called the sympathetic chain ganglion. So they contain the preganglionic sympathetic fibers, okay, so the ones that were sort of running from the spinal cord to the ganglion, and they've branched off of the spinal nerve, and they link to adjacent sympathetic chain ganglia. The sympathetic fibers grow cranially to caudally, okay? So instead of sort of running from the spine out to the body, these chain ganglia are sort of running from the top of the spine to the bottom and vice versa, creating what's called the sympathetic trunk. So that creates two directions in which the neurons can travel coming out of the spine. Now, after we have or have not, depending on the neuron, gone into a sympathetic chain ganglion, the spinal nerve is going to split into what are called two different rami, a dorsal ramus and a ventral ramus. The dorsal ramus leads toward an epimere and the ventral towards a hypomere. Now again, reminder, the epimere and the hypomere are derivatives of the myotome, that sort of very, very early muscle structure. The epimere will go on to become the back muscles, and the hypomere will go on to become the muscles of the body wall, the abdomen, and the limbs. So essentially, the spinal nerve then sort of splits to either go into the epimere or the hypomere, taking its motor and sensory neurons with it. Generally, this process of innervation is segmental, meaning that the epimere and the hypomere at the level of the spine are innervated by the neurons coming from that same spinal level, although there are variations. And for sensory neurons in particular, they do sometimes innervate a level above or a level below where they came out of the spine. Now again, the book goes into much more detail than we are going to do in lecture regarding all these nerves and where they go and what their names are and what their functions are, again, beyond the scope of what we can do for this class. But I do think it's worth highlighting sort of the basic pattern and structure of these pathways. So on the left, we're showing the sympathetic innervation of the organs of the thorax and the head, okay? And you can see that they follow sort of this cranial to caudal pattern up and down the spine, innervating multiple organs along the way. And then the parasympathetic innervation of the visceral organs, which remember we talked about occurs sort of cranially and caudally, but not in the middle and sort of the trunk and lumbar regions. Finally, the cranial nerves. So there are two types of ganglia, two types of groups of cell bodies that you find in the head, the cranial nerve ganglia and the cranial parasympathetic ganglia. The cranial nerve ganglia are derived either from neural crest cells or from ectodermal placodes, or sometimes from both, and they contain the cell bodies for the sensory neurons associated with the cranial nerves. Compared to the cranial parasympathetic ganglia, which arise only from neural crest, and in there we see sort of two divisions, the vagus nerve, which is responsible for the visceral organs, and then the cranial nerves, in this case 3, 7, and 9, that serve the head structures. Now, there is sympathetic innervation of the cranial nerves, but it actually comes from chain ganglia within the cervical spine, so the portion of the spine that's sort of in your neck and not from within the brain itself. And that's going to be about all the detail we can do for this. If there are questions, let me know, but we're trying to break it down to make it a little bit more manageable for the time frame that we have for this class. If in doing that I've left out something that impeded your understanding, please let me know and we'll go over it.